Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back thousands of years, somewhere between the golden shimmer of desert sands and the slow, steady breathing of the Nile. You're not in your bed anymore. You're curled up inside a cool mud brick house in ancient Egypt. Outside, the air still holds the last warmth of yesterday's sun, and the breeze smells faintly of river silt and crushed lotus. But morning's almost here, and soon this place is going to wake up. And because the ancient Egyptians didn't believe in sleeping in, their days were ruled by the gods, the stars, the river, and believe it or not, water dripping slowly into bowls. Forget iPhone alarms or snooze buttons. If you missed your ritual duties at sunrise, there was no polite apology, just divine disapproval. Possibly a demotion, and a whole lot of sacred side-eye from your fellow priests. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I'd love to know when and where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Nile flows gently just outside your door. You hear it before you see it, the soft lap, lap, lap of water brushing against moored reed boats. Somewhere nearby, a cow snorts, a dog stretches and lets out a low, lazy yawn, and above you, the dark sky begins to exhale the stars. This is Egypt before the sun comes up. Not silent exactly, but not busy yet either. It's a transitional hush, the kind of moment you only notice if you're... In ancient Thebes, people lived by rhythms older than kings, and mornings weren't triggered by one single alarm, but by a gradual collection of cues. A sound here, a smell there, a subtle shift in the breeze that told you the night had turned. Most families slept on simple mats, often on flat rooftops during hotter months. Imagine lying there as the night cools off, just enough to pull a linen cloth up to your shoulders. A few scattered voices call out across the neighborhood, someone tending an early fire, someone arguing with a goat, and then you hear it, the flutter of ibis wings overhead. To Egyptians, birds were more than background noise, they were celestial messengers. The sacred ibis, associated with the god Thoth, often appeared right before dawn. Its hoarse croak was like the universe nudging you, hey, time to rise. But not everyone rose at the same time. If you were a temple servant, your day began long before most others. You didn't just wake up, you were expected to be ready. Robes straight, incense ground, chants memorized. Your alarm clock was a mixture of responsibilities, rituals, and probably an elderly supervisor poking you with a stick.
For the average villager, though, the wake-up was gentler. Nature did most of the work. The eastern sky would take on a pale hue, light gray shifting to rose, then to the signature gold of Egyptian mornings. That moment was sacred. Ra, the sun god, was said to emerge in his solar boat from the underworld each morning. His reappearance wasn't just light, it was life, which is beautiful, yes, but also pressure, because if the sun's making its divine debut, you better not be caught snoring through it. And so people stirred, slowly but purposefully. You might roll over, rub your eyes, and catch a whiff of something brewing, a pot of sour beer bubbling over coals, or maybe bread baking in a clay oven. These weren't just food smells, they were time smells. Your nose, like everything else in Egypt, was trained to the day's unfolding. There was no exact moment when morning began, no beeping gadget. Instead, you had the cues your body learned over years, the rise of heat in the air, the squeak of a neighbor's wooden door, the muted crunch of sand under sandals as someone headed to fetch water. But the river, always the river, was the truest clock of all. Its flow was predictable, but varied just enough to signal change. When the water rose after the annual flood, it brought silt and new time markers. Farmers would listen to its speed, feel its coolness, judge its mood. Before calendars, before sundials, they had the Nile. Children were often the first up, not because they were disciplined, just restless. You'd hear their giggles or the thump of small feet overhead. Maybe they were chasing chickens, maybe just watching the sky change colors. Either way, their energy was contagious. Adults followed, slowly, grudgingly. And then the village would stir to life. Fires relit, donkeys braying, pottery clinking, a woman humming as she kneads dough, a man coughing dramatically into the morning air. Your bones ache a little, not unpleasantly. You roll your shoulders, sit up, and stretch. The mat beneath you still holds the shape of your sleep. Your linen tunic smells faintly of reed smoke and sweat. You stand, barefoot, and step into the beginning of the day. Quietly, but knowing the hum of it is just starting to build. And if you're really paying attention, you might notice something small and peculiar. The priest's apprentice across the street carrying a dripping ceramic jar, already counting its slow, deliberate drops. But that, dear listener, is a story for the next section.
You catch the apprentice's outline in the half-light, his narrow frame barely distinguishable from the clay walls behind him. He's shuffling carefully, both hands wrapped around a slightly chipped, wide-bellied vessel that glistens in the dimness. He's moving like someone carrying a sleeping animal, or, more accurately, someone under strict instructions not to. That vessel? It's not water for drinking. It's not part of the temple's cleaning ritual either. It's a Klepsydra, a water clock, and in the coming moments, it will help decide when an entire temple begins its day. Time in ancient Egypt wasn't measured by ticking seconds. It was poured drop by drop from one container into another. The Klepsydra, though simple in design, played a surprisingly central role in temple scheduling. Imagine a rounded jar with a tiny hole at the bottom, like an ancient leaky bucket, except you're supposed to let it leak. Water drips out in measured rhythm, and as the level inside falls, lines or notches carved along the inside wall indicate how much time has passed. Now, of course, the exact rate depends on the size of the hole, the thickness of the jar, and whether the apprentice remembered to fill it all the way. So, was it accurate? Sort of. Reliable enough to wake priests, unreliable enough to cause at least one daily argument between the historians. Still argue whether Klepsydras were used solely for religious rituals or had practical use in civil timekeeping as well. Some believe there were large-scale clocks for legal proceedings and shift changes in palace work crews. Others suggest they were limited to sacred duties, timing chants, offerings, or when to unlock the god's inner sanctum. In the case of temple life, though, there's no debate. The Klepsydra was a timekeeper, a wake-up call, and a spiritual metronome all in one. The apprentice lowers the jar onto a short stone pedestal inside a side chamber of the temple. Already others are stirring. A senior priest appears, his linen robe immaculately pleated, his expression somewhere between serene and slightly irritated. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't have to. His presence is the unspoken alarm clock for everyone else. With one glance, he checks the water level, noting where the fluid rests against the inner marks. He gives the slightest nod, just enough to signal, begin. And so they do. There's no dramatic fanfare, no sudden burst of movement, just a quiet chain reaction. One priest lights the incense, another begins muttering the opening prayers, voice low and breath still heavy with sleep. A third adjusts the seated statue of the temple's deity, wiping its face gently with a cloth soaked in perfumed water. These rituals had to start exactly at the right moment, which is both deeply meaningful and wildly impractical when your alarm is a dripping pot. Still, the Egyptians were nothing if not precise. Their temple operations ran on a missed the mark, and the gods might not listen. Or worse, they might respond grumpily. Some temples used multiple Klepsydras, rotating them to account for changing daylight hours. You see, Egypt divided daytime and nighttime into 12 parts each. That means 1 hour in winter was shorter than 1 hour in summer. So time was flexible, wobbly even. But that didn't make it less serious. If Ra's boat sailed too late across the heavens, the whole world might lose its balance. Now imagine being the poor priest assigned to monitor the Klepsydra overnight. You sit there, in semi-darkness, surrounded by flickering oil lamps, listening to water drip, drip, drip. It's a miracle more of them didn't fall asleep mid-shift. Or perhaps they did. That might explain the slightly frantic nature of some morning ceremonies. And yes, there were workarounds. If you overslept, you could try to sneak into the lineup during the third hymn, maybe sprinkle some extra myrrh around to mask the lateness. But temple hierarchies were strict, and everyone knew everyone else's schedule. If your job was to open the curtain behind the falcon statue at precisely waterline mark number 7, then that was your moment. Interestingly, some scholars believe the Klepsydra wasn't always used to wake people up, but to check whether you were already awake and ready, sort of like an ancient punch clock. If the water was at line 4 and you were just walking in, well, good luck explaining that to the high priest. Outside the temple, as the sun inches closer to the horizon, the city begins to stir as well. But it's slower, softer. The noise builds gradually, like steam rising off hot bricks. Inside, though, the day is already in motion. The gods don't wait, and neither do those keeping time with pottery and hope. The apprentice watches the jar, eyes half-lidded, counting drops in his head. He probably wishes he were still asleep, or that the gods would accept fashionably late offerings. But alas, this is Egypt. Time trickles on, and even divine beings expect punctuality. The temple's rhythm builds like a hymn that doesn't need a conductor. The Klepsydra's drip provides the cadence, though it's so quiet most don't hear it consciously. But it's there, marking out sacred time, not with chimes or gongs, but with patient, unstoppable water. A reminder, every moment, once passed, flows away forever. Outside the high temple walls, the rest of the city is now stirring, but let's stay a moment longer within these cool limestone corridors. Because the Klepsydra wasn't just an alarm clock. It was also a spiritual tool. It didn't merely wake people up, it woke up rituals. You walk along the narrow hallway where other Klepsydras are kept. These are different sizes, some used for longer periods, some just for short sequences, like timing incense offerings or music intervals. Each has a spout, a base, and a humble beauty, smooth from years of handling. Some are plain, others carved with decorative lines or tiny lotus patterns. They were often made of alabaster or ceramic, and a few rare examples even had internal columns with inscriptions, marking the passage of hours. And now comes the fun part. They didn't always leak out. Some Klepsydras were filled at the bottom and allowed to fill upward through pressure. A visual reminder that time could rise as well as fall. A rather poetic metaphor for the sun's journey and the soul's ascent. The most famous Egyptian Klepsydra ever discovered was found in Karnak, dated to the reign of Amenhotep III. This beast of a timepiece, nearly a meter in diameter, sat in the temple precinct like a quiet overseer. With its inner inscriptions, it helped priests track time during night watches when the stars were obscured or the moon refused to cooperate. Historians still argue whether time was measured for practical or symbolic reasons in these cases. Did the dripping water actually control when rituals happened? Or was it simply a meditative aid to guide the mind? Was time itself divine, or just a tool for organizing divine performances? In either case, the Klepsydra had one job: consistency, a dripping oracle.
A liquid reminder that the gods were always watching, even if your fellow priests were dozing. And while temple rituals marched on to the rhythm of water, a more informal kind of timekeeping emerged in homes and workshops. If you were wealthy, maybe you had a small Klepsydra of your own. Not for religious ceremony, but to time cooking or naps. Yes, naps. Time in Egypt wasn't linear like ours. It was cyclical, seasonal, and deeply tied to mood and purpose. Think about it. If you've ever boiled tea and walked away for just a minute, you've done ancient timekeeping. They'd do something similar. Fill a small pot with water, let it drip, and
It's the kind of timing that invites slowness. You don't rush water. Of course, there were drawbacks. The drip rate changed depending on temperature, air pressure, and impurities in the water. If you used river water during flood season, forget about accuracy. The thing might empty twice as fast, and now you've burned your lentil stew and missed the window for Ra's hymn. Still, it was reliable enough that larger cities began to rely on Klepsydras for more than temples. Judges in court cases, yes, even back then, would time how long someone could speak using these devices. A legal monologue, literally trickling away. One can imagine a particularly long-winded scribe pleading for a second jar to be filled. "But, Your Honor, I haven't even reached my best metaphor." Back in the temple, the main ritual of the morning is reaching its peak. The god's image is unveiled. The room smells of cinnamon, myrrh, and burning palm. The priests, moving in almost dreamlike synchronization, each performing gestures passed down across generations. All of it timed by a bowl of dripping water that now nears empty. It's easy to romanticize, of course, to imagine the scene as ethereal, majestic. But here's the truth. One priest has a cold and keeps sneezing into his sleeve. Another is clearly mouthing the words. The apprentice in the corner looks like he's fighting sleep, which, to be fair, he probably is, because he's been up since before dawn refilling jars and wiping statues that don't blink. But even in their weariness, there's a kind of beauty. They showed up. They followed the rhythm. They didn't need an iPhone on their bedside table. They had the Nile, the sun, and a dripping pot, and somehow it was enough. As the last drops fall from the Klepsydra, the final prayers are whispered. A small bell is struck once, softly, more out of tradition than need. The ritual is done. And somewhere in a far corner of the temple, the next apprentice picks up the empty jar and begins the quiet walk to refill it, ready for the next hour, the next chant, the next rising moment. By the time the temple returns to its usual mid-morning lull, the rest of the city is fully awake, though fully is a generous term in this heat. You've left the sacred grounds behind now, strolling along a dusty street where small shops are opening, goats are already plotting their escape from flimsy pens, and someone has just sneezed into a linen sleeve in the same way as that half-awake priest. But let's not rush into the urban bustle yet. Before mechanical time, before sundials even became widespread, the first and most immediate alarm clocks for everyday Egyptians were animals. And not in the friendly farmyard Disney chorus kind of way. You're lying in your home, stretched out on a woven mat, face half buried in your arm. Then, honk. Not from a car, obviously, from a goose. A very irritable goose who has strong feelings about being left out of breakfast. Its voice cuts across the courtyard like a cracked trumpet. The Egyptians had plenty of livestock, cattle, goats, sheep, but geese, ducks, and even ibises roamed the courtyards of many homes, especially those near the river. They weren't just food sources. They were early risers with strong opinions and zero volume control. These creatures were involuntary timekeepers. Before your eyes could even register the rising light, your ears were already getting the message. Now, let's imagine you're a farmer, and your home is perched at the edge of a canal. The frogs start first, croaking rhythmically in a chorus that sounds like they're either blessing your field or conspiring against it. No one's sure which. Soon after, the donkeys begin to bray. Loud, long, and with a strange sort of urgency, like they've suddenly remembered they're late for something. And if you're especially unlucky, you'll get the hippopotamus. Yes, you heard that right. Ancient Egyptians lived close to the Nile, and hippos, though not exactly tame, would sometimes wander uncomfortably close to towns. Their territorial grunting, low and deep, could carry for miles. To wake up to that sound is to question whether you're still dreaming or about to be trampled by an angry semi-aquatic cow. Some residents even considered these sounds as divine messages. A goose honking just before sunrise might mean good weather. A frog chorus suddenly going quiet could signal a predator nearby, or, more importantly, that it was time to hustle. Historians still debate whether these animal clocks were actively relied upon, or simply part of the background rhythm that people learned to interpret instinctively. Did people train themselves to wake with the frogs? Or did the frogs just annoy them out of sleep? Probably a bit of both. There's even a theory that certain temple rituals were intentionally timed to coincide with natural animal cues, like the calls of ibis birds, which had strong associations with Thoth. One scholar even joked that the first sacred alarm in Egypt may have been a grumpy goose named after a deity. The goose's name is lost to history, sadly. So in a sense, the Egyptian morning sounded like a symphony written by Mother Nature herself. Honks, croaks, brays, grunts, and the occasional confused meow. Not exactly peaceful, but oddly comforting once you got used to it. And amidst all this chaotic harmony, humans joined in. A woman might call out to her neighbor, "Hot coals today," referring to the communal oven. Someone's child was probably yelling about a missing sandal. Someone else was grinding grain with a stone, and the rhythmic scraping added its own percussion to the dawn orchestra. And then there were the dogs. Now, dogs in ancient Egypt were more than pets. They were companions, guards, even spiritual figures. But they also had impeccable internal clocks. Some owners swore their dogs woke at the same time every day, regardless of season. And if your dog decided it was time to get up, you were getting up too, whether you liked it or not. Some of these dogs were even used unofficially by neighborhood watchmen. Their barking, paired with the animal chorus, created an overlapping mesh of sound that told everyone, dawn is here. Or at least, it's close enough. You roll over, blink up at the increasingly pale sky, and stretch your arms wide. The goose is still honking. The donkey, now on repeat, sounds like it's reliving a breakup. The frogs have entered a second verse. It's no use trying to go back to sleep, so you stand. The ground under your feet is already warm. A sleepy chicken waddles past you like it owns the place. And despite everything, despite the noise, the dust, and the occasional threat of hippos, you smile. Because there's something grounding in this noisy, feathery, four-legged alarm clock. No batteries required. Just instincts, fur, feathers, and a world already awake before you are. You step out from your doorway, feet brushing against sun-warmed sand that still carries the memory of cooler night. A yawn escapes before you can stop it, and somewhere nearby someone echoes it. The city is in motion now, not with the grandeur of temple rituals, but in the slow, intentional rhythm of daily labor. And here's where we shift our focus, not to the elite, not to the priests or the scribes, but to the people who had no water clocks, no sacred ibis alarms, and definitely no sleepy apprentices to keep track of their time for them. Let's visit the people who woke up because they had to. The fishermen, the potters, the brewers, the field hands. Their alarm clocks weren't divine. They were practical and occasionally very unpleasant. Start with the baker. You duck beneath a rough lintel into a home that smells like flour and ash. The air is already thick with heat, not from the sun yet, but from the enormous clay oven tucked in the corner. She's there, the baker, kneeling beside a mixing bowl almost as wide as her arm span. She's been up for a while, long enough to grind the emmer grain, mix the dough, and begin shaping small loaves. How did she know when to get up? Smell. That and muscle memory. Every evening she prepares the starter dough, a sour mash left to ferment overnight. When it reaches the right stage, swollen, just sour enough, beginning to bubble, it sends out a distinct aroma, sharp, earthy, tangy. That smell is her cue. When it hits the air just right, she knows it's time. No Klepsydra, no bells, just her nose and years of repetition. Historians still argue whether such sensory-based timekeeping was formalized in any way. Some say there must have been spoken markers, phrases like, "when the starter speaks," or "when the smell turns sour." Others believe it was all passed down through gesture, experience, and intuition. Either way, she's already kneading by the time the rest of the neighborhood begins stretching and scratching their heads. And soon, she'll deliver the first round of bread to the nearby temple, because even gods need carbs. Not far from her, the brewer is also on the move. You step into his courtyard, where two large jars stand next to a cluster of sleepy goats. The jars are warm to the touch, and inside them, a thick, sweet-smelling liquid froths gently. He stirs one lazily with a wooden paddle, squinting at the color. For brewers, timing was everything. Let the mash ferment too long and it becomes sour, or explosive. Not long enough, and it tastes like barley soup. The secret? Temperature. The moment the sun touched the edge of his southern wall and began warming the jars, the brewing process changed. The trick was to be there just before that moment, to feel the shift in air, the stretch of shadow, and to listen for the tiny pops of fermentation starting to bubble. He doesn't need a clock.
Farmers had their own methods.
Before the Nile flood season, they'd wake based on the stars. Sirius, the dog star, was the most famous celestial cue. Its heliacal rising, its first visible appearance just before dawn, signaled the coming flood and, by extension, the start of the agricultural year. But on normal days, it was all about routine and the body's memory. A farmer might wake with the first cool breeze that slipped across the canal before dawn, or when his neighbor's ox began stomping in its pen, or even when the neighbor himself slammed his door, muttering curses about stubborn livestock. There's a theory among Egyptologists that sleep was polyphasic, split into segments. Farmers may have dozed early, woken before dawn for initial tasks, then rested again after sunrise. Their alarm was not one event, but a sequence. Stars fading, temperature rising, the scratch of linen against their skin. It was the kind of rhythm you couldn't teach, only learn by living. And there were the city workers, the potters, carpenters, and leather tanners, whose day began with the sounds of others. For them, the morning chorus was the alarm. The squawk of a goose, the grinding of grain, the splash of buckets hitting water, and the shout of an apprentice tripping over something. Again. You find yourself in a small courtyard workshop where two brothers are pounding wet clay into a slab. They pause only briefly to wipe their brows and glance at the sun's angle. Not yet full morning, but the work has begun. They don't track time. They track tasks. When the first pot is shaped, we light the kiln. When the fifth is done, we stop to eat. That's how they structure the day. In a world without clocks, time isn't a number. It's a smell, a star, a sound, a shadow, a whisper in the clay. You live by the sun's warmth on your shoulder, the scent of burning straw, the moment the frog chorus falls quiet. You don't measure time, you notice it. And somehow, that works. No one misses temple bread delivery. No one forgets to stir the beer. The looms still produce linen. The fishermen return when the light turns gold. No ticking, no buzzers. Just the body, the senses, and a whole lot of trust in the rhythms that never fail. The sun is properly up now. It glints off the rooftops, spills into narrow alleyways, and brings with it the full orchestration of daily life in ancient Egypt. The river shimmers, the air buzzes faintly with the sound of insects. But in the temple precincts, something very different is happening. Because even though the rest of Egypt is already ankle-deep in chores, one group of people has only just reached the halfway point in their shift. The night watch. Step quietly with me into a dimly lit corridor deep inside one of the larger temples, perhaps Karnak or Edfu or a more modest shrine tucked beside a city wall. The hallway is cool, shadowed, thick with the scent of spent incense and flickering torch smoke. And at the far end, slumped on a low stool, is a man doing everything in his power not to fall asleep again. This is one of the temple watchmen or gatekeepers, a low-ranking official in a very important role. His job? Stay awake all night, every night, and ensure the sacred chambers are guarded, the offerings remain undisturbed, and the gods don't get cranky. And, crucially, he must monitor the Klepsydra. See, the water clock wasn't just for morning rituals, it was active through the night.
That steady drip, drip, drip didn't pause when Ra disappeared into the underworld. In fact, you could argue it became more important after sunset, when stars blinked into view and human eyes weren't quite reliable anymore. Every so often, perhaps every hour or half hour, the watchman was supposed to check the water level, mark the passage of time, and call out the appropriate sacred phrases. These might have been simple intonations, "The third hour has passed," or slightly more poetic versions like, "Ra journeys now through the fifth gate of darkness." That's assuming he's awake, of course. Historians still argue whether these hourly calls were always performed or if they were aspirational duties, expected but inconsistently enforced. After all, it's hard to enforce divine punctuality if your entire workforce is nodding off while holding a torch. And that's where it gets interesting. To prevent these night watchers from drifting into sleep, temples may have implemented additional methods of timekeeping and accountability. One theory proposes a rotating circuit of bell strikes or chimes, a way of confirming auditorily that someone was awake and moving at intervals. Others speculate that some temples had two-person teams where one would rest while the other paced, and then they'd switch, like a sacred buddy system against boredom. But more likely, there was guilt, and maybe even fear. Being caught asleep on duty wasn't just an embarrassment, it was sacrilege. You weren't protecting a room of scrolls. You glance over at the Klepsydra again. It's a squat alabaster bowl this time, placed on a painted pedestal and half full of shimmering water. A line just below the rim marks the last recorded hour. A papyrus tally nearby shows previous times, likely scratched down by the earlier shift. The water flows slowly from one small hole, landing with a soft, almost apologetic sound. It's not dramatic, it's not showy, but it's relentless. And it tells time better than the man watching it. In a nearby room, another watchman is chanting, low, repetitive syllables in a sing-song rhythm. It's not meant to be understood, not by human ears. It's for the gods. And let's be honest, maybe a little for himself. Keeping your voice moving is a good way to keep your eyes open. You step out into the courtyard, where a third man is walking slow laps between pillars. He's holding a torch in one hand, a staff in the other. Every now and then, he taps the staff against the stone. Clack, clack, clack. A heartbeat in the night. And then you see the real source of accountability, a scribe. He's younger than the others, barely 20, but already carrying himself with the weary pride of someone whose job is mostly writing down other people's mistakes. He glances at the Klepsydra, nods, and writes something on his wax tablet. Was the chant on time? Did the torch stay lit? Did the gate close at the third hour? This little network of watchers, counters, and scribes created a strange midnight bureaucracy, one where the ticking of time was replaced by dripping water, flickering shadows, and muttered prayers. Interestingly, there's evidence that some temples had star clocks as well, diagrams painted on ceilings or walls that charted the movement of constellations through the night sky. These diagonal star tables weren't precise clocks, but they provided a sense of progression. If Sirius had crossed this beam, it was the fourth hour. If Orion's belt touched that star, it was time to rotate guards. Some temples combined both, star clocks for the skies, Klepsydras for the earth. Between them, they stitched a framework of holy hours that wrapped around the darkness like a blanket. But even in that sacred precision, you can imagine the all-too-human struggle of the watchman. Sitting in silence, listening to dripping, trying not to nod off, whispering the same chants over and over, hoping the scribe doesn't write down that your chant was late again. The night watch was less about action and more about endurance, a battle against sleep itself, waged in sandals by firelight. And just before dawn,
As the stars begin to fade and Ra stirs in his solar boat far below the horizon, the watchmen ready themselves for the handover. The morning team will arrive soon, and with them comes relief, food. The stars melt into the lightening sky. As Ra's return begins to paint the Nile in pale gold, you slip back into the everyday world of the living, leaving behind the bleary-eyed watchmen and their dripping clocks. Outside the temple, city life is ramping up with purpose. Boats are pushing off from the banks. Merchants are rolling open reed mats. Children dart between courtyards, laughing and nearly tripping over sleepy dogs. But let's shift our focus to a different kind of timekeeping, one rooted not in ritual or shadows, but in sound. Because long before bells were invented or tower clocks chimed across town squares, ancient Egyptians developed a surprisingly sophisticated sense of sonic scheduling. And one of the most fascinating examples? The morning trumpet. Well, trumpet might be a little generous. It wasn't made of brass or played by someone wearing sequins. But Egyptian temples and palaces did have trumpet-like instruments, most famously the long, narrow metal ones discovered in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Yes, King Tut had 2 trumpets buried with him, one of silver, one of bronze. Historians still argue whether these instruments were used for music, for ceremonial calls to attention, or for functional timekeeping. But here's what we do know. They were loud. And in an ancient city built largely from mud brick and limestone, loud meant wake-up call. Now, we can't say with certainty that trumpet blasts functioned like a town alarm clock, but it's highly likely that certain notes, blown at dawn or dusk, signaled major shifts in the day's rhythm. Temple doors opening, palace gates unlocking, morning rites beginning. You're walking through the palace quarter now, and ahead of you, a boy about 12 stands at the edge of a sunlit colonnade. He holds a narrow horn to his lips, and with a sharp breath lets out a piercing call. It cuts through the hazy morning like a hawk's cry. Everyone within earshot reacts, subtly. A scribe straightens his scroll. A baker quickens her kneading. A group of servants hauling baskets of fresh linen pause, exchange glances, and move just a little faster. It's not panic, it's rhythm. The day has officially begun. But trumpets weren't the only sounds used to track time. In workshops and military garrisons, wooden clappers, 2 planks slapped together, might signal the start or end of a shift. In some cases, a rhythmic series of claps might regulate labor. Think of it like a human metronome. Clap, step, clap, lift, clap, stack. This wasn't just useful, it was motivating. If you've ever tried folding, there's even evidence of gongs or tuned stones being struck in larger temples, producing low, resonant tones that could travel across a courtyard and announce moments like the start of midday offerings or the closing of sacred doors. And here's a fun theory. Some Egyptologists believe the daily drumbeat of certain priesthoods may have been as close to a public clock as ancient Egypt ever got. These drums didn't toll the hour, but they did toll a mood, a shift, a moment to pay attention. It's not hard to imagine. You're walking past a market stall, the buzz of conversation dips. From somewhere behind the temple walls, a drum thuds once, then twice. You pause, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. That sound means it's time to clear the path. Something sacred is beginning, or ending. For ordinary people, this soundscape created a kind of aural clock, a daily loop of recurring sounds, each tied to a specific activity. The morning trumpet, the midday chant, the market drum, the distant echo of Klepsydra drip, if you were near the temple. Even domestic spaces had their own auditory markers, a mother calling out for her eldest to fetch water, a neighbor pounding herbs with a stone, the sharp knock of a carpenter testing finished wood, a dog barking at the same passing oxen every single morning. Over time, your body learned to recognize the order of sounds as a way to understand time. Like, that's the second goose honk, better finish breakfast. Or, that's the priest's third chant, I've got 20 minutes before my father notices I'm not in the field yet. There was even music as timekeeper. Some historians propose that communal tasks, such as weaving or bricklaying, were regulated by call and response singing. If your group repeated a song twice, you knew the task was halfway done. If someone started a third verse, you'd better pick up the pace. Sound was time, and time was communal. Evenings had their own sonic palette, the call of water jars being stacked, the sigh of fire being blown into life, the low murmur of families preparing their evening offerings. And just as the trumpet might start the day, a specific chant, or even silence, would mark its close. And here's a charming detail. Some city districts may have had their own distinct sonic signatures. One neighborhood might wake to temple chants, another fishermen calling across boats, another to the rhythmic clatter of copper pans being laid out for the day's cooking. So next time your phone buzzes at 7 a.m., try to imagine an older version of that moment. A goose honking, a trumpet blaring, a child shouting, "Ma, the bread man's here," all layering over each other into a morning melody as old as cities themselves. And somehow, it all worked. Time wasn't held in the palm of your hand, it was floating in the air around you. The Nile glints like hammered gold in the full light of day now, lazily stretching out across its floodplain, as if it, too, has nowhere better to be. The city is humming, the workshops are rattling, and the morning sounds have given way to the steady clatter of daily business. But let's take a quieter path now, past the priests and bakers, beyond the riverbanks and potters, and follow someone who didn't wake because of drums or Klepsydras or donkey brays. Let's talk about the scribes. You pass beneath a shaded arch and into a courtyard where papyrus plants sway gently in clay pots. In one corner, beneath a low reed awning, a young man is hunched over a wooden board, his reed brush dipped delicately into a shallow dish of ink. He's been here a while. Not long enough for his ink to dry out, but long enough for the morning to settle into his bones. Unlike the farmers and brewers and trumpet blowers, scribes didn't rise with the animals. They rose with the paperwork. In ancient Egypt, scribes were essential to everything: temple accounting, government records, correspondence, land deeds, tax logs, legal scrolls, you name it. Their waking time wasn't set by nature or even by ritual. It was set by the arrival of the first summons. Some of these came in the form of a physical messenger, a young assistant darting from office to office with a clay tablet or verbal request. Others came in subtler forms. If you worked near the palace, the sound of the first chariot's wheels on the stone road might be your signal. If you worked in a trade office, maybe the buzz of merchants unrolling their ledgers got you moving. But for many scribes, sunlight was the key. Scribes needed clear, strong light to do their work. Artificial light, torches or oil lamps, cast too many shadows and made papyrus glow unhelpfully, like trying to read a receipt in a candlelit cave. So when the sun reached a certain slant, strong enough to fall directly across the workbench, that was their call. Not an alarm clock, a shadow line. You can imagine it now. A narrow band of gold sunlight slipping through a carved screen, landing directly on the edge of the scribe's workspace. That line of light moves steadily, predictably, over the course of the morning, and the scribe learns to track it. When the light touches the top edge of my ink dish, it's time to write the names. When it reaches the bottom, it's time for lunch. Historians still debate whether formal sundials were commonly used by scribes. Some argue that portable shadow clocks, small L-shaped devices that cast a movable shadow, were used to chart time in segments. Others believe and yet, not every scribe was a morning person. Some records from administrative centers like Deir el-Medina show scribes noting late arrivals and marginal notes, often with passive-aggressive flair. Teti did not appear until the shadows passed the second column. Translation: Teti slept in, again. But let's be honest. Teti probably didn't have a Klepsydra in his bedroom. Maybe his goose was quiet that day. Or maybe his window faced west. The tools of the scribe were humble but sacred. A flat board, a few brushes, a pot of black and red ink, and a measuring string to guide straight lines. Every tool had its place, and when the sunlight struck the board just so, the work began. And it wasn't just bureaucracy. Scribes also copied stories, hymns, poems, and medical texts. The act of writing was a performance, a kind of visual chant. The neatness of your script reflected your discipline. Sloppy handwriting, sloppy mind. To keep time while copying longer texts, some scribes used line counts or verse breaks. By the end of this hymn, the sun will reach the edge of the pillar. And if it didn't, either your handwriting was slow or the gods were playing tricks with the sky again. In fact, one delightful fringe theory, mentioned by exactly one ancient writer, is that some scribes used the length of a cat's nap as a unit of time. Apparently, there was a common belief that a well-fed temple cat would nap for roughly a quarter of the working morning before relocating to a warmer patch of stone. So a scribe might say, "I'll copy to the end of the story," or until the cat moves. Not exactly ISO 8601 standards, but charming nonetheless. Scribes also tracked time by disruptions. The moment the servant brought tea, or when the master called them into the next room, or when the sun struck the wrong part of their scroll and made the ink gleam painfully in their eyes. These moments, repeated daily, became landmarks. Even breaks had their timing. At a certain hour, the shade would vanish from one side of the courtyard, and all the scribes would scoot to the other side like sunflowers on wheels. And eventually, the ink began to dry. The reed brush began to fray, and the sun moved on. Scribes didn't need clocks. They had shadows. They had sunlight. They had the rhythms of cats and chants and neighbors clattering bowls. And when their eyes grew tired and the last word dried on the papyrus, they would stretch, set down the pen, and mark the end of the day with a simple phrase: "It is written." By midday, the air hangs thick over the city like gauze. Even the geese, usually vocal participants in the daily schedule, have quieted, seeking shade under palm fronds or staircases. You too are beginning to slow. The heat presses against your back like a persistent elder nudging you toward rest. But don't lie down just yet. We've reached one of the most curious and often overlooked features of Egyptian timekeeping: the midday lull. You know that moment when the world just softens? When the light grows too bright for comfort, the shadows too short to offer shelter, and the streets empty as if someone rang a giant invisible bell? That's what this is. But in ancient Egypt, it wasn't just a response to the sun. It was structured. Many laborers, artisans, and even temple workers observed a kind of scheduled slowdown around midday. Not an official break in the way we might imagine lunch hour, but more like an instinctual pause, a collective sigh. And yes,
This pause was guided, in part, by the sun. Step into the courtyard of a workshop now. You'll see the potters setting down their tools, wiping sweat from their necks. The fire in the kiln is still going, of course. Heat doesn't take breaks. But the workers drift into whatever shadow they can find. One leans against a half-formed pot. Another swats at flies with a piece of linen. No one speaks unless they absolutely have to. This is midday rest, and it's as close to a siesta as ancient Egypt allowed. It begins when the sun reaches its highest point, zenith, and shadows all but disappear beneath your feet. For temple astronomers and sundial readers, this moment was predictable and measurable. Certain types of shadow clocks, flat L-shaped sticks with a movable gnomon, were realigned halfway through the day to catch the shifting angle of the sun. When the shadow vanished entirely, that was your cue. In fact, one surviving inscription jokes about a man missing the offering because the stick made no shadow, which might have been ancient Egyptian for, "I overslept my appointment." So yes, they noticed. They measured. But they also felt it. Even animals obeyed this rhythm. Dogs sprawled under tables, cats curled beneath baskets. Even the usually restless donkeys seemed content to just exist. Historians still argue whether this pause was enforced or merely observed. Some suggest temple routines slowed deliberately, that chants were spaced farther apart during peak heat. Others propose it was simply a matter of practicality. When it's 40 degrees C and you're wearing 2 layers of linen, you picture a priest now, gently splashing rose-scented water over a sun-warmed idol. The sound of the water hitting stone echoes softly. The Klepsydra drips nearby. Outside, the city naps. But in here, time moves forward. Slowly. Fluidly. Elsewhere, in administrative offices, scribes may have taken this moment to pause their writing and review what they'd already recorded. There's a clay tablet listing workers present on a midday shift, and next to some names, the phrase, "entered late," due to heat. The ancient version of stuck in traffic. Except the traffic was sunlight. And while the scribes paused, merchants did something clever. They used the lull not to rest, but to tend their shade. Yes, really. Market stalls were built with clever layers of reed, fabric, and sometimes wet clay to keep them cool. Around midday, you'd see merchants dousing the stones at their stall's base with water, not to clean them, but to cool them. The evaporation dropped the air temperature by a few degrees. Not much, but enough to make you think twice about lying face down in the sand instead. And in homes, midday was nap time. Not universal, of course. Someone always had a goat emergency. But in many households, particularly among the middle class and elite, the hour after zenith was reserved for stillness. Children were encouraged to rest. Adults might eat a small meal, bread with figs or honey, and then recline on low benches or mats, eyes half-lidded, listening to the hush that fell over the neighborhood. One papyrus even hints that dreams during midday rest were more likely to be messages. Perhaps because the silence was deeper, or perhaps because the sleeper was more vulnerable in the light. There's even an apocryphal account of a physician noting that patients healed faster when they were encouraged to sleep during the hottest hour. Was it scientific? Probably not. But it's the kind of wisdom that only generations of experience can teach. Some scholars believe that public clocks, like obelisks, may have had decorative elements that hinted at these midday pauses. The shadow of an obelisk at noon, after all, is nearly invisible. It may have marked not only the height of the sun's power, but the moment when human activity yielded to it. And perhaps that's the key to this entire rhythm. Egyptians didn't fight time.
They didn't try to squeeze more hours out of the day. They moved with it. They listened. They paused. And when the sun was directly above, they didn't ask it to work harder for them. They simply found the nearest patch of shade, shared a fig with the neighbor, and waited. The shadows have returned. They stretch slowly along the ground, no longer hiding beneath your feet, but reaching lazily eastward, marking time in lengths instead of hours. It's afternoon now. The hottest part of the day is behind you, and Egypt begins to breathe again. Doors creak open. Workers return to their posts. Scribes squint at their scrolls with renewed resignation. And amid all this, a new kind of timekeeping takes over. The embodied kind. Because if mornings in ancient Egypt were ruled by animals and rituals, and noons by shadows and rest, then afternoons were ruled by the body. You step into a weaving workshop, where several women sit at tilted looms, their hands moving almost without thought. A spindle hums. A comb clacks. The air smells like flax and sweat and sun-warmed fiber. No one's checking a clock, but everyone knows what time it is. How? Because their backs are starting to ache. The women here have been working long enough that their arms tingle in a familiar way. The light has shifted just so, catching on the frame of the loom. And one of them knows it's about time to stretch, because the calluses on her palms feel hot instead of tight. It may sound unscientific, but for many laborers in ancient Egypt, bodily cues were more reliable than tools. When your knees throb in a certain pattern, it's probably been 2 hours. When the sun has warmed your shoulder through your linen just enough to cause a shiver of discomfort, it's mid-afternoon. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional system, learned through apprenticeships, or a cultural rhythm developed through experience. Likely both. Just as a farmer learns to read the clouds, a brewer learns to smell a mistake, and a weaver learns to feel time in her fingertips. You follow one of the weavers as she stands and steps into the courtyard. She blinks at the light. Then, without a word, she tosses a small pinch of sand into the air. Why? To test the wind. You see, in the afternoons, the Nile Valley often receives subtle, predictable gusts. Nothing dramatic, just a sigh of air moving downstream. For those who worked outside, these breezes were not just a comfort, but a signal. When the first wind brushes your face, it's time to change the water for dye. When the fig leaves rustle twice, begin the next chant. Even more intriguingly, some workshops kept wind jars. No, not jars filled with air, but carefully balanced vessels that would emit a low whistle when the afternoon breeze reached a certain strength. Part humidity gauge, part timekeeper, part musical companion. Imagine it, you're sorting papyrus stalks, half dozing in the monotony of repetition, when a soft ooh sound escapes from the jar near the entrance. You don't look up. You just nod and move to the next step. That sound means it's roughly the 9th hour, around 3 p.m. in our terms. In cities along the Nile, larger buildings acted as communal clocks in another subtle way. Their shadows stretched like sundials across courtyards and alleys. A child knew she'd better be home before the shadow touches the spice stall. A servant timed his errands by the way the sun hit the roof tiles of the governor's residence. One particularly quirky historical detail comes from a merchant's ledger that includes the phrase, "Arrived late, excuse, pigeon was missing." Now, either this was the ancient version of "my dog ate my homework," or it hints at trained birds being part of a timed routine. Pigeons were used for messages, but some believe they also served as informal hour markers. Certain birds were fed at regular times. If they didn't show up, something was off. And then there were water routines. Afternoons were often the time for washing, yourself, your tools, your linens, but not just because it was warm, because the sun had moved far enough to heat the stone basins just right. A pot of water that sat in shadow all day would be too cool. One that had basked since noon? Perfect. Some households even tracked time by the cooling of tea, or more precisely, herbal infusions. If the drink cooled to a certain temperature, it was time to stop working, or start preparing for the evening offering, or chase down the goose that escaped again. In the fields, farmhands moved according to the color of the soil. When the ground turned from pale tan to rich gold under the low sun, they knew they had about an hour left. That's when tools were gathered, oxen unyoked, and bundles prepared for the walk home. And then there were echoes. Yes, echoes. In stone quarries and palace courtyards, workers began to recognize how sound changed as the air cooled. A hammer strike that rang sharp at noon began to dull. A voice that echoed crisply off a temple wall grew softer. It was subtle, but perceptible, and it told those who listened that evening was on its way. You sit for a moment on the edge of a plaza. Children are playing nearby, but their voices carry differently now. Less piercing, more hollow. Your back is warm from the sun still, but not hot. A breeze tousles your hair just once, like a finger brushing past a wind chime. You don't need to check a dial, or a sundial, or a shadow stick. Your body already knows. The day is tilting toward its end, and the city around you, without buzzers, without alerts, without notifications, is already adjusting. Evening draws closer, the golden light begins to thin out, taking on that faint pinkish hue that makes limestone glow and skin appear gentler. The buzz of the day softens, not vanishing, but mellowing into something more musical. Footsteps slow, voices grow lower. Everything starts to exhale. You're walking back toward the river now, past clusters of houses whose rooftops are suddenly alive. People are climbing stairs with baskets and water jugs. Neighbors greet one another across alleys. And for many Egyptians, this rooftop hour marks something more than relaxation. It marks the transition. From day to night. From toil to worship. From structured time to something looser, more personal. This, dear listener, is where the final clock of the day begins. The human eye. No, really. There's a charming theory among scholars that many Egyptians marked the approach of night not with sundials or clepsydras, but with the changing behavior of their own vision. Think about it. When the sun dips low enough that you can no longer comfortably read your papyrus, or when the shadows across your loom become too long to follow, that's your cue. The day's official duties are over. But for those in charge of ritual, this final stretch of time was among the most sacred and the most carefully observed. Step with me now through the courtyard of a local shrine, not a grand temple, but a small neighborhood sanctuary dedicated to a regional god. The air is cooler, the incense more pungent. A pair of priests, their heads freshly shaved and robes clean, are preparing for evening offerings. And guess what's there beside them? Another Klepsydra. This one is much smaller than the one from the night watch, almost dainty. It rests on a wooden table beside a platter of fruit and a tiny copper brazier. But make no mistake, it's measuring time as deliberately as ever. Evening rituals needed to happen at very specific intervals, so the gods wouldn't be confused or offended naturally. One priest is chanting, the other is watching the water level drop. When it reaches a marked notch etched into the side of the bowl, he nods, and a dish of honey is added to the offering table. And yet, as strict as this sounds, there's something deeply gentle about this part of the day. Everything slows. The offerings are smaller, more symbolic. A spoon of wine, a few grapes. A prayer that's less booming and more like a lullaby. Outside the temple, the timekeeping becomes even more creative. In family homes, mothers might mark the hour by the scent of bread cooling. Others might listen for the first calls of nocturnal animals, a frog chorus from the canal, or a lizard skittering across the floor. There's one account, faintly humorous, of an old man who told time by the sound of his neighbor's bad singing. He always sings as the sun dies, poorly. And then there are the candles.
Not clocks, but proxies.
Oil lamps, to be precise. Shallow bowls filled with oil and a floating wick. Some were marked with burn lines, tiny notches of grooves that indicated how far the oil would drain in a certain span of time. If your evening reading required only a half hour of light, You'd fill the lamp just to that notch. The lamp became your clock. Historians still argue whether these time lamps were widespread or limited to elite households. Some claim they were functional. Others believe they were symbolic, offering the user a sense of control over the length of the evening. Either way, there's something cozy in the idea. A gentle flame, a fixed pool of oil, and a quiet understanding. When this light fades, it's time to sleep. In rural areas, farmers might track evening by watching the stars reappear, one by one. The first was usually Venus, bright, low, known in ancient Egypt as the star of the evening. Its arrival signaled the moment to bring animals in, finish eating, and start the slow climb toward bed. And for those watching the heavens, there was one more guide, the rising of Sopdet. Sopdet was the deified form of the star Sirius, the same star that heralded the flooding of the Nile when it rose at dawn in midsummer. But in other parts of the year, it appeared in the evening sky, marking not seasons, but time's quiet passage. When Sopdet rose, the gods were watching. The night had begun, and so had a very different kind of time. Now, instead of busy schedules and temple chants, time was kept by stories. A grandmother would begin a tale, always long, always winding, just as the last edge of sun disappeared. Children gathered close, watching the oil lamp flicker. And before the story ended, half of them would be asleep. A different kind of clock. One not measured in hours, but in plot twists. And always, the night would close with rituals. A small prayer. A pinch of natron scattered to purify the threshold. Perhaps the wrapping of a charm in cloth, laid beside a pillow. Even for those too poor to afford elaborate offerings. A whispered word to the gods before bed was common. And just before sleep, a final look at the sky. Not for navigation, not for schedules, just for the reassurance that the stars were in their places, that time was, somehow, still ticking forward. The stars are out in full now. You're back near the river, where the air smells of damp stone and silt, and the night hums with a kind of sleepy electricity. Crickets chirp. A frog sings somewhere under a wooden walkway, and above, the heavens blaze, not chaotically, but with deliberate grace. Because for ancient Egyptians, night wasn't a void. It was a clock made of light. You tilt your head and look up. What seems like a scattering of stars to us was, to them, a calendar, a schedule, and a sacred story all in one. The sky wasn't just decoration, it was divine infrastructure. This brings us to the last and grandest system of Egyptian timekeeping, the decanal stars. Imagine dividing the night sky into 36 groups of stars. Each group, or decan, rises above the horizon for 10 days at a time, cycling through the year. But at night, each decan would rise roughly every 40 minutes, one after another, in a predictable, glowing parade. So, if you were lying on your rooftop mat, watching the stars climb the eastern sky, you didn't just see twinkles, you saw minutes passing. Temple astronomers knew these patterns intimately. Some even painted diagonal star tables inside coffin lids or temple ceilings to track when certain stars would rise throughout the year. It wasn't superstition, it was scheduling. You might say the night shift's Klepsydra was the cosmos itself. You're sitting beside one such priest now. He's perched cross-legged atop the temple's roof, head tilted skyward, eyes scanning for the next decan. A papyrus sits beside him with inked notations. It's not idle astronomy, it's clockwork. He murmurs a phrase as a particular star cluster crests the horizon. That's his cue. Somewhere below, a junior priest begins a new chant. It's all perfectly timed. One star rises, one prayer begins. The gods, after all, are watching. You wouldn't want to be late. Historians still argue whether these observations were for ritual purposes only, or if they had civilian applications. Did farmers use decans to know when to rise early? Did night watchmen track the time by constellations? We don't know for sure, but even casual stargazers would have known at least the first few decans by heart. It wasn't just decans either. The Milky Way, known to the Egyptians as the Celestial Nile, served as both symbol and clock. Its gentle arc across the sky mirrored the earthly river, and its position shifted with the seasons. When the river bends across Orion's shoulder, an elder might say, "We have a month until the fest." The Book of the Night, painted inside royal tombs, divides the nighttime journey of the sun into 12 hours, each guarded by serpents, lions, or protective gods. While symbolic, these 12 hours suggest a conceptual night clock, something you could feel, even if you couldn't measure it exactly. Back outside, the temple priest rises and scribbles one last note. His watch is over. He won't be relieved by someone holding a torch. He'll be relieved by another constellation. Back in the villages, people aren't tracking stars quite so carefully, but their relationship with night is just as practical. A boy, lying beside his father on a rooftop mat, points up. "That one again. The one like a bent arm." His father nods. It's time to cover up. The wind will come soon. They've learned that certain stars appearing overhead coincide with changes in temperature, in wind, and even mosquito behavior. Over generations, the night sky became predictable enough to plan sleep around. In wealthier homes, personal astronomers, or just elders with great memories, could tell the time by star position. They didn't need to look at the sky every minute. They'd glance once, note the placement of Sirius or Canopus, and mutter, "Fifth hour, almost halfway." There's even a theory, highly speculative but fun, that dogs barked at specific star patterns and owners could learn to track time by their behavior. It's likely nonsense, but isn't it wonderful to imagine someone sitting up in bed, hearing a distant bark, and thinking, "Ah, Orion, right on time." Back inside the temples, the rituals grow quieter. The night chants now are soft and steady, less about spectacle and more about endurance. The Klepsydra keeps dripping, the stars keep shifting, and somewhere in the rafters, an old scribe stretches and begins a sleepy tally. These final hours before dawn are the most elusive. The city is wrapped in a gentle, starlit blanket. The oil lamps burn low, the wind rustles the reeds, and while the rest of the world dozes, time itself feels softer. Not because it's paused, but because it's no longer something you measure. It's something you drift through, as if the very stars are whispering, "You've done enough today. Let it go." The final hours before dawn are the quietest. They hum with a stillness so complete, it feels like the entire city is suspended in breath. The river barely ripples. Lamps gutter low, casting long shadows that sway gently on the plastered walls. Somewhere in the distance, a solitary donkey brays once, then falls silent again. Even the frogs have taken a break. You are awake, not fully, but enough to notice this rare kind of hush. It is neither day nor night. It is between, a strange, liminal time that Egyptians knew intimately. And yes, they had a way of tracking even this. Welcome to the time of dreams and ghosts. Not in a spooky sense, well, not entirely, but in the sense that this last stretch of night was believed to be when the boundary between the mortal world and the divine grew thinnest. This was when the gods were closest, when the sun was battling its final stretch through the underworld, when spirits could whisper, when dreams could deliver messages. And if time was looser here, it was also sacred. You stir slightly in the dark and hear it, a low, rhythmic drip. The temple Klepsydra is still going. It hasn't stopped once. It's smaller now, its water level almost gone, but it continues its patient, ancient task. One drop, then another. It's not measuring time, so much as keeping the silence company. Priests may have still been active during these hours, particularly during festival seasons or important celestial events. But even in quieter periods, someone was always assigned to monitor the passage of night. And what did they measure? The reappearance of light. Not the sun itself, not yet, but its heralds. Before the sun crests the eastern horizon, there are signs. The dim brightening of the sky, the first cry of a bird, the breeze shifting from land to river. And most importantly, the arrival of the morning star, Sopdet, or what we call Sirius. In this context, Sirius wasn't just a calendar marker. In the pre-dawn hours, it was a countdown, a beacon, the last star before the world began again. You're watching it now, just rising over the temple walls, bluer than the others, sharper. The priest beside you, older, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, nods. There she is, he murmurs. Prepare the flame. Down below, a novice lights a torch, not to warm or to see, but to summon. That flicker of fire is the first movement in a long sequence of morning rituals designed to greet Ra's rebirth. Because this next stretch of time is incredibly important. It's sunrise before the sun, a time when everything prepares for motion but hasn't yet moved. In homes across the city, a subtle stir begins. Someone shifts beneath a linen blanket. A child turns and whimpers softly, caught in a fading. There's even a phrase in ancient Egyptian inscriptions that translates loosely to the hour of light's promise. Not light itself, but its guarantee. The world doesn't glow yet, but it will. And that's enough to begin. Some of the wealthier homes had their own timekeepers, small personal Klepsydras or incense clocks. Yes, incense clocks. These were sticks or trails of resin set to burn at a very steady rate. When the scent changed, or when the ash reached a marker, the household knew it was time to wake the servants, prepare the first fire, or begin offerings. Historians still debate how precise these incense clocks were. One theory suggests they were segmented, each scent representing a different time span. You might fall asleep to cedar and wake to myrrh. Aromatic time. Time you could smell. And in the palaces, the approach of dawn was marked with music. You remember the morning trumpet from earlier? Well, that same instrument, or sometimes a drum, was played softly as the sky lightened. Not for the public, but for the palace staff. It told cooks to stir their fires, scribes to prepare their boards, and guards to begin their final watch rotation. And you're standing on a balcony now. The air is cool. A gentle breeze comes off the river. Sirius gleams above, just on the edge of fading. Below you, the city stretches, breathes, turns. And then you hear it. The first bird. A sharp cry. Not melodious, but clear, specific. A signal so ancient, even the stone beneath your feet seems to twitch in response. The priest on the roof lifts his face. The young boy in the courtyard stops sweeping. A scribe, already seated by his scrolls, straightens his back. And still, no sun. But it's coming. Everyone knows it. This last sliver of night is almost gone. And you realize something remarkable. No one's surprised. Because everyone has tracked this moment, every day, for generations. Without clocks, without buzzers, just by knowing where the stars should be, what the wind should feel like, when the owl should stop calling. Time, in these moments, isn't mechanical, it's relational, felt, lived. You don't measure it, you belong to it. The light is here. Not bright, not burning, just enough to dust the tops of palm trees and glint across the calm Nile like a promise slowly being fulfilled. You're standing at the edge of a rooftop, linen wrap tugged tight around your shoulders, and you can feel it. The day is about to begin. But not like a modern alarm jolting you upright. No, this is slower, deeper, more reverent. The Egyptians didn't just notice sunrise, they orchestrated it. As the eastern sky warms to a soft ochre, you hear the first stirrings from below. Doors creak open, wooden sandals scuff courtyards, water jugs clink gently as they're lifted to shoulders. But before the true clamor of day begins, one act must take place. The Temple Awakening. In temples across Egypt, from great sanctuaries in Karnak and Luxor to modest local shrines, the priests begin what might be the most sacred and time-sensitive act of the entire day. Waking the gods. Yes, that's right, the gods, like the rest of Egypt, had to be roused, not because they were lazy, but because they had spent the night traveling through the underworld. Exhausting work. Now it was time to reestablish their presence in the mortal world. And that meant ritual, incense, and perfectly timed motion. You step quietly through a temple's outer courtyard. The stone is cool under your feet. In the sanctuary, an officiating priest moves like a dancer, precise, rehearsed. Every gesture is choreographed to a rhythm kept not by clocks, but by breath. The ceremony includes the opening of the mouth rite, a symbolic feeding of the statue. Incense curls in symmetrical swirls, water is sprinkled, linen cloths are changed. Every action has its pace, and yet no one says, "You're 5 minutes late." They say, "The sun has touched the lotus pool." That's how they know it's time. And what are the sun's signals? The first golden line crossing a specific threshold stone, the moment the highest point of the obelisk catches light, the second crow of a courtyard rooster, or if you're near the Nile, the sparkle of light across a water clock's surface. Yes, even now, Klepsydras are in use. Set at nightfall, they've been trickling slowly for hours, measured to expire precisely at sunrise. A priest checks the last few drops. When the flow ceases and the bowl is empty, the day has begun. Historians still argue how accurate these sunrise-timed Klepsydras were. Some suggest priests adjusted them nightly depending on the season. Others believe their purpose wasn't to tell the priest when to start the ceremony, it was to confirm that the priest had kept time correctly through intuition and tradition. In either case, it was a tool of reassurance, not command, a whisper, not a whistle. You move back outside and join a group of workers gathered at the city's edge. The sun is just peaking now, a sliver of molten bronze rising behind distant date palms. One man, and then, with no sound but footfalls and rustling linen, they begin walking. At the same moment, no bell, no supervisor, just time, sensed and shared. And here's a fun tidbit. Some Egyptians marked this early phase by watching how light moved through architecture. In certain homes and buildings, small stone channels or angled windows were built to catch the first sunbeam and direct it inward, like a solar spotlight. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, about a baker's apprentice who was always late, until his master made him live in a house with a sun hole above the bed. "Now the god himself wakes you," the old man said. Unsurprisingly, the boy never overslept again. And for those far from temples or light shafts, there was always sound. By now, the city is truly waking. A wooden wheel turns, a child shouts, a goat bleats, offended. The rhythm builds. This isn't chaotic, It's musical, a slow crescendo. And right in the center of it, you. You're not checking your wrist. You're not glancing at a wall. You're just feeling it. Even time in Egypt's legal system moved this way. Records mention trials scheduled for the rising of Ra, or when the second sun mark reaches the doorway. One contract states that repayment is due on the third morning after the festival flame is relit. Days weren't numbered, they were named, marked by natural cues and communal rituals. You're watching two scribes now prepare their tools for the day. One dips his brush into ink, the other glances at the sun and murmurs, "Just above the pillar. We'll finish the census before midday." No one argues. They just begin. Because here's the secret. No one owned time. Time wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a boss. It wasn't a source of anxiety. It was a river, like the Nile itself, flowing gently through each life, guiding rather than commanding. And now, the golden light fully embraces the street. Birds hop along the rooftops. Bread bakes in the courtyard ovens. Your linen robe flutters in the first true breeze of day. And you realize something simple and profound. The Egyptians may not have had smartphones or alarms or smart watches, but they were never late. Because they listened to water, to wind, to shadow, to star. And time always, always answered back. The day is fully born now. Light spills across every rooftop, dances on the Nile, and warms the shoulders of farmers already knee-deep in irrigation ditches. Birds compete for the loudest morning song. The city breathes in, slow, deep, prepared. You're moving through a narrow alley now, the stone still cool underfoot but bright with promise. You pass a baker setting out loaves dusted in barley flour, a boy herding ducks with a stick, and a woman measuring oil in a tall clay jar, her finger dipped just once inside to feel how full it is. And in all of this, you notice again, there is no rush. The Egyptians had no word for schedule the way we mean it. They didn't believe in being early or late by the minute. What mattered was rhythm, harmony, that each thing happened at the right time, not the fastest. And so, this final section brings us back to where we began, ancient Egyptian alarm clocks. You might have pictured them as gadgets, something mechanical, a string that tugs a bell, a sundial that chirps. But the truth is softer, slower, and more elegant. Because in ancient Egypt, the world was the alarm. It wasn't about what woke you. It was why. The sun had returned. The gods had risen. The fields were waiting. That was reason enough. Still, the Egyptians were nothing if not clever. They did experiment with more deliberate forms of waking. There's evidence, fringe but fascinating, that water clocks were sometimes set with tiny float triggers. The idea being, when the water rose to a certain level, it would tip a small object, causing a sound, a clink, a splash, a thunk. Not loud, not jarring, just enough to shift a sleeper's breath. Another theory? Drip pots, simple bowls with minuscule holes in the base, hung above a clay plate. The slow, steady dripping could serve as a timer. When the plate filled, the change in sound, light tapping turning to a full splash, might have signaled time to rise. Of course, these tools weren't common. They were likely used by temple staff, elite households, or those engaged in highly specific rituals. Most Egyptians relied on more familiar triggers: the smell of morning bread, the cooling of night breezes, the moment the temple trumpet cried out across the rooftops. You remember that trumpet, don't you? It sounded back in Section 2, long before the sun broke the horizon. That single, clear note wasn't just a signal to wake. It was a promise that light would return, that time would move, that you had a part to play in this ancient and beautiful machine. And now, with the day in full swing, you see how the historians continue to debate just how accurate Egyptian timekeeping was. Some argue it was deeply imprecise, an art more than a science. Others say we underestimate them, that their temple calendars and astronomical records rival even those of Babylon and China. But in truth, that argument misses the point. Because for the Egyptians, accuracy wasn't the goal. Alignment was. With sun, with river, with gods, with one another. And maybe that's why their clocks didn't need to shout. They just needed to flow. So now, as the workers settle into their tasks and the temple resounds with gentle chants, you find yourself thinking, could time be softer? Could it whisper instead of bark? Could we, like them, learn to measure it by the length of a shadow or the taste of the air? To know that it's midday because the water tastes warmer? To feel the hour in your spine? And maybe, just maybe, wake not because of a digital tone, but because the breeze shifts, because something ancient inside you stirs and says, it's time. And now, dear listener, let it all fade. Let the temple grow quiet again. Let the priests bow once more into silence, their rituals complete. Picture the water clock, its last drop falling into the basin, a soft echo that disappears into stone. Let the sky darken, stars returning one by one, like shy musicians tuning up before the next performance. The Milky Way arcs overhead, gentle and eternal, and even Ra himself begins his nightly voyage beneath the world. You're not in ancient Egypt anymore. Not really, but a part of you is still there, tucked beneath linen, listening to frogs by the riverbank, waiting for the first bird to call. The sun has set, or perhaps it has yet to rise. It doesn't matter. Time, for now, is nothing to fear. It won't chase you. It won't scold you. It will simply be, drifting forward like the Nile, measured not by minutes but by motion, not by alarms but by feeling. So let your breath follow that current. Let your body soften, your eyelids sink. You've walked with kings, watched stars become clocks, followed the hush between each drip of ancient water. And now you've arrived at the best hour of all. The one where nothing is asked of you. The one where time stops keeping track. The one where you sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.